really thrilled by it. And it really, I was really fascinated to see that there was kind of psychology, cosmology, philosophy, and Judaism all mixed together, articulated in such a sophisticated way. It was well beyond anything that I'd been exposed to as a child. But when I got to the second book, Shaar, Hayichud, Vehemunah, or in English, The Gateway to Unity and Faith, I always had a problem with it. I never really kind of unpackaged what was going on. And it was only when I actually translated it and wrote the book, basically, that I actually made sense of it to myself. So I'm going to share with you some of that experience that I have. So just for a couple of minutes, the context. What is the context of this book? So, as you know, Judaism is a monotheistic faith. We believe in one God, but that can have many different readings. So the classic interpretation, which is called theism, means there is a God in the heavens, or as Aristotelian philosophy would put it, there is a unmovable mover. There's some sort of first cause, and that is created the world, and in the Jewish belief is all powerful. What Hasidic texts do, especially the texts we're learning, is they're really articulating the Kabbalistic view of monotheism. And this is quite different from the classic version. So in the classic version, God is a cause for the universe, but he in no way identifies with the universe. He is divine, we are non-divine. So there's a very sharp demarcation between the divine, the creator, and the created. And if you look in a classic text of Jewish philosophy, such as Maimonides, Guide for the Perplexed, he will tell you there's absolutely nothing you can say about God. And he proposes a theory of negative attributes, which he says, well, you can't say God is kind, because when you think of kind, you're going to think of, I don't know, your mother, some kind person, and then you're going to impose a human kindness on God, and that's inappropriate, because every divine quality is incomparable to the human. So you could say God is not unkind, but you couldn't say he is kind, because that is saying too much. So God creates the world, but he is not the world. So in the Hasidic paradigm, which we're studying here in Shaar, Hayichud, Vehemunah, it's quite different. And if you just remember this one line, I think as a running thread throughout the book, it will help you. And that one line is that in Hasidic text, God doesn't create the world, God becomes the world. Okay? So what do I mean by that? So before we get into the precise summary of each chapter, you know that this text speaks very much about the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and how they are agents in creation. And so basically what's happening is God is putting his energy into the letters of the Aleph base, and that itself becomes the world. So, I mean, it might be a slightly crude, slightly oversimplistic, but I think it very much sums up the point. God is becoming the world. He's not just creating it. And the reason why that's important, because Hasidic movement is a movement of divine closeness. The Baal Shem Tov, who was the first teacher of Beshti and Hasidism, he wanted to emphasize how, you know, in the trees, in the flowers, in nature, in every single thing, you can find God. So in the Maimonidean view, that's not really true, because you can find God's providence. God is supervising the world, but he didn't become the world. He created it, and it's quite different from him. So you can only find God in a flower in terms of God is so amazing that he caused that flower. But in the physical body of the flower itself, there was no divinity. Whereas according to the Hasidic version, God kind of became the flower. He wrapped himself, he diluted himself, he took his energy and he manipulated it, and he made tzimtzumim, contractions, till eventually a flower pops out. So you're looking at the flower, you're really looking at a manifestation of God directly, and therefore God becomes much closer. That, I believe, is what the author's trying to do in this text. He's trying to articulate an intelligent version of the Hasidic doctrine of divine closeness, or divine immanentism, if you want a more philosophical term. So I won't elaborate on this too much further because we want to get to the summary of the text itself. But I can actually, is there a box I can share something here, a chat box or something? Where's the rabbi?
I think you just click on chat, right? On the more thing.
More. Can someone open up the chat box so I can post something? Here we are. I see it. Chat. Okay. So I wrote a kind of lengthy introduction in my book, which I've put online if anyone wants to read it. So I'm going to put a link here. You can download it. The introduction, which is more on these themes. Now, there's also another dimension to this book. So I'm going to show you here. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to use parts of my book to help us tonight. There we are. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it. All good.
So this is what I put at the beginning of the book, which is a summary of the structure of the book. And, I'm also going to put this in the chat. Can you put a PDF in the chat? Do you have to put a download link? I'll try.
I don't know.
Let me try and put it, see if it works. Stop that a second, get back into chat. Yeah, it looks like it. All right, that might have worked. As a PDF of these 2 pages in case you want to refer to it yourself. I'll just put it back on the shared screen. So without getting into all the details here, you'll notice that besides introduction, there's 2 basic areas. One I call the illusion of our world. That's chapters 1 to 7. And then chapters 8 to 12 is the unity within God. And I believe you're just embarking on chapter 8 or 9. Is that correct? So let me just say a few words about this. This is the core structure of the book. There's really 2. It's 2 works within one, or 2 issues. The author is trying to prove that God is one. And the way he's going to do that is he's going to, in the first 7 chapters, prove that everything outside God doesn't really exist, or it exists in such a flimsy way, it's so dependent on God that it doesn't have independent existence. It's totally, what's the word I'm looking for? Reliant on a continual input of the divine energy. So therefore, if your income relies on someone to give you money, then as soon as that person stops giving you money, you have no income. So the same with the world. The existence of the world relies on a continuous input from God. If he would take that away, the world would cease to exist. And therefore, even now, when it does exist, its existence is contingent on a force outside itself, on the divine input outside itself. So therefore, it has no true existence. Obviously, we're not saying the world's not here. It's not a complete illusion, but it's not as robust as our senses make out. Table here, microphone here, seems very robust. Actually, this is all swimming inside God. It's all contingent on a continual input that we don't see. The senses cannot see this. The mind can argue that it exists. The intuition can sense that it exists, but it's something our senses do not experience. And therefore, the world is, and I put illusion in speech marks, because we don't believe that the world's completely illusory, because then Shabbat is meaningless, then tefillin is meaningless, which obviously the Torah attaches meaning to these things. So the world does exist, but it exists contingently. It exists in such a flimsy way, you can't call that real existence. So that's chapters 1 to 7, to prove that everything outside God does not exist. And then chapters 8 to the end, we're talking about inside God. So inside the Sephiros, which are 10 divine energies, we want to prove that this is not 10 gods, that God's attributes are one with him. So just a word on the attributes. Divine attributes is not an innovation. of Hasidic thought or Kabbalistic thought. This exists in Talmudic thought, classic rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud and Midrash, the rabbinic, the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud. They speak of something called Midas Hadin, the attribute of judgment. They speak of Midas Harachmim, the attribute of compassion. And this is, that's the correct term, attribute. So what is a divine attribute? So there's no 100% clear answer to this question. The divine attributes are either aspects of God himself, or perhaps they have some kind of the kind of tools that God is using. Like, you want to put up some furniture, use a screwdriver, so maybe they're God's screwdrivers and his toolkit. Or later on, they came to believe there's an element of both. So we have this, I don't know if you've encountered this idea, but in the Sifrot, we have lights and vessels. The light would be an energy within God. The vessel would be more that it's a kind of screwdriver. But the rabbis can never really decide, so they said it's both. And there's elements of both. It's a bit like in physics. Is light a wave or a particle? So with my limited A-level physics, I recall that it behaves as both. So that is what these divine attributes are. But basically, in a nutshell, they're within God. They're not outside the divine. They're energies that God created within himself before he creates the universe. As my late teacher, Rabbi Fitzi Lipska, who unfortunately was killed in a car crash 26 years ago this week, he told me when God emanated the Sephiros, he was giving himself a personality. He gave himself some sort of, because plain Ein Sof, the infinite it's abstract, it's unrelatable. So he imposed on himself these relatable qualities. So the end of the book, from chapter 8 to the end, is basically saying, even though there's these 10 qualities, there's still one. It doesn't mean there's 10 gods. They're all one. So anything inside God, let me just share this again in case you don't have it up. The unity within God is that the attributes are one with him. So everything inside God is one. The illusion of our world, everything outside God is zero. So the summation of the two together is that God is one, and he is the only real existence in the universe. So that's a kind of very broad overview of the text. So let's now kind of go chapter by chapter and see how he builds these arguments. We do know from his student that the author of the Tanya, Rabbi Zalman, wanted to create a longer work. This is kind of incomplete. In the early editions of it, he kind of wrote at the end, to be continued, or chosa is the Hebrew term, lacking, and that's what rabbis write when there's still some more I want to say, but he never said that, and we just kind of have it as it is. And let me just say, before we dive into the summaries, it's quite actually, even though Judaism gave this gift to the world of the idea of one God, there's not many authors who sat down and wrote a book about it. I mean, if the tens, I have a hard drive with like 80,000 Hebrew books on. The number of books who actually on the topic of divine unity, such as this, if you could count them on one hand or two hands, it's not a lot. So this stands out as an unusual piece of literature, not the first, but a very significant and rigorous one. Okay. And you probably recall, I don't know if Rabbi Yisrael mentioned in earlier classes, that the author, this is the second book of Tanya, but the author wanted to put it first originally, and he changed his mind. Because to put it in contemporary terms, basically his publisher told him, this ain't gonna sell, it's too complicated. You gotta put the easier stuff first. That's my theory. So he ended up putting this first, but the fact that he wanted to put it as the first book shows that kind of he was the most proud of this piece of work as being tremendously important. Okay, so let's, I've highlighted some passages here in my book, which I'm going to, oh no, that's the wrong thing. I want to view comments. Here we are. Okay. So I'm going to switch to a one-page scroll here. If you can see this, all well and good. Otherwise, I'm just going to read it out and then put it in my own words. So the first chapter, sorry?
We can see.
Okay, good. The first chapter is really built on this idea, which is actually sourced in the Midrash, classic rabbinic Judaism, but is tremendously, the Midrash is shelves of text, and it's just a couple of lines there. So here it is showcased as a fundamental teaching. And so I'll just read it out. That the idea is these Hebrew words, the words of creation, when God says, let there be a firmament, what does he put here? Such as let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. These Hebrew words and their constituent letters forever stand in the heavens. That's a quote from Psalms. And the Midrash interprets that to mean that God didn't just say, let there be light, and that was a one-off occasion, and then he kind of went back to heaven and did his own thing while the world was running itself. No, he's constantly creating the world. And if he doesn't constantly pump in this energy, then the world will cease to exist. So what do we have here to start with? We have here a radical rereading of the power of language. Language is usually considered to be a convention. Why do we call a cat and a table a table? These words were assigned to those particular objects. In any other language, there are different words assigned. Language is just a convention. And actually, Maimonides maintained that. He maintained that even Hebrew is just conventional. There's no real special, he said there's special qualities, but language is still conventional. In the mystical thought, in Kabbalistic thought, and this goes way back to Sefer Yetzirah, which is really a proto-Kabbalistic work. It's a work of mathematics, of logic. It really precedes Kabbalistic thinking, but informs it. There we have the idea that language is power. And the best way I've thought of explaining it is a language is a packet of energy or particle of energy. And specifically, we mean here divine energy. Because God doesn't just create the world. Remember, he becomes the world. And the principal way he does this is he invests his energy, divine energy, or multiple different types of divine energy in the letters, and then the letters power the world. So you have Ein Sof, infinite light of God. You have 10 Sephiros, which is divine energy. Then you have the letters of the Aleph base, and then you have the world. So there's just very few stages of God kind of dressing himself up in the world. So this is an example of me trying to be clever. I put the universe, we are told, only exists from virtue of divine Hebrew language, which means that language is reality and existence is convention. Normally we say the other way around, that language is convention, existence is reality. But if you understand that really the thing that's powering the universe is language, and language is real, and existence, why does a table happen to be created? Because God decided that the word table in Hebrew would create that object. So that's more of a convention, but that's just me trying to sound clever, but you get the basic idea. So the key emphasis here is that the creation of something from nothing is an ongoing process. And that, I have some more things in chapter 1 here. And he takes this straight from Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah describes the wheel of 231 gates. And the way this works is you draw Aleph all the way around the 22 letters throughout the alphabet, and you connect every single letter to every other letter. And you have this web. And this is, it's a kind of hub of energy. So in America, the Chicago airport is a hub, which basically means every single flight in America can go to Chicago. And if you want to go anywhere that doesn't have a direct flight, you can go to Chicago and come out. So it's the busiest airport in America. So that's what this wheel of 231 gates is. It's a hub of energy. God gets the 22 letters of the Aleph base. He wants to make a chair. He puts it through this hub and a chair pops out. He puts it through the hub and something else will pop out. It's like the hub. That's the best way of thinking about it. So he's lifting this straight from Sefer Yetzirah, this idea. It's a philosophical combination of two things: classic midrash, that creation is ongoing, and Sefer Yetzirah, that the method of ongoing creation is through energetic packets in the form of the letters. Okay, this is fundamental. Now, chapter 2, he more or less elaborates on the same idea, but he puts the way he introduces chapter 2 is this is a response to heretics. And you have to remember that both in medieval culture and in early modern culture, rationality was supreme. I will not go into rant now about how we're in the post-truth era and how all politics is motivated by these kind of, limbic brain responses and how the world is changing. But basically, we're easing ourselves out of that era from the postmodern turn to where we are now. But when this book was written, religion was discussed as arguments. You wanted to prove something, you had to prove it. So he articulates these ideas in a more kind of logical fashion. And first example he gives is basically, if a craftsman makes an object, that object exists without his input. But God, the way God creates, it needs the constant input of God. And he brings this illustration from the sea splitting. The sea was splitting, the Torah says, from a wind blowing. So if you imagine a wind pushing up a wall of water, if that wind stops blowing, the water's going to pop down. Okay? Rabbi Yoel Kahn, who was the leading scholar of Chabad Hasidism in the 20th century, he would always illustrate it with a rock. And he would say, you throw a rock up, the rock's moving up, it keeps going up, and then it stops, then it comes down. So what's happening here? If you just saw the rock on its way up and you didn't know it's going to come down, you would think that rocks go up. But what's actually happening is the rock only continues to go up so long as it has energy from the throw. And as soon as that energy runs out, then it comes down again. And so the world's like that. The world looks like it exists, but the world's existence is like the movement of the rock upwards. It's only there so long as God puts in the energy. If God stops putting the energy, it would come down, God forbid, then it would come down again. So that's the key themes in number 2. He then also gives the example of prophecy, which I put here represents an intermediate level of divine letters, lower than the Torah, but higher than the letters they are found powering this world. So when a prophet receives a message, it's in text. If you read the text of the prophets, it's a text. So these are kind of luminous letters, which are envisioned by the prophet. Prophecy is a vision. And that's another example of how letters are more than convention. Obviously, if a prophet's seeing this, this is some sort of divine revelation. Okay, now let's move on to chapter 3. So I'm going to read out a passage here. The previous discussions have been theoretical. If God would cease to create the world constantly, it would cease to exist. But thankfully, he has not done so, and we are still here. So how is the idea of continual creation meaningful to us now that God has chosen to sustain our existence constantly? It's not just a theoretical idea. So, as I mentioned at the very outset, the point of continuous creation, the doctrine of continuous creation, is to show how our existence is flimsy and insubstantial. As the Tanya puts, in relation to the causal power, God, which brings all created entities into being, we are null and void. That's obviously, we're not null and void, we're here, but in relation to the power that keeps us in existence every second, we are null and void. And so in chapter 3, he wants to give us this idea of this tremendous dependency on the divine energy that's powering the universe. And again, this is trying to make us feel close to God. If we just take the Maimonidean idea that God once created a world and it's kind of sitting here without further input, God is distant. But if we understand that just for this very bottle of water to continue to exist, God's pumping his own very self into it, then we can use a meditation of that bottle as a starting point, come to awareness of the divine. It's actually that divine is in my hand. It's not just simply an idea or simply something in heaven. That's really what he wants to bring out in number 3, that the flimsiness of physical existence points to the immanence of the divine presence. Now, this is actually a philosophical position called panentheism. That's not a Jewish term. It was originally proposed by some philosopher 100 or 200 years ago, but it fairly accurately describes the Tanya's position. Theism means that God exists. Pantheism, which was the view of Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, who really founded Enlightenment thought and parted from the Jewish community, but his ideas became very popular. So he basically said that there's no God in heaven. God is the sum total of everything in the universe. So pantheism, pan is everything, theism, God, everything's God. But there's no God in the heavens to appeal to. God is just the sum total of everything. Panentheism takes both. It takes the power of God in theism. God is all-powerful, God is omnipotent, God transcends the world, he creates the world, but also panentheism, en means in. So we are in God. Everything is in God. We're kind of icebergs swimming in the sea of God. We're ripples on the ocean of the divine. Everything is within, everything in the universe is within God, and yet that's not the totality of God. God is more than that, and that's the theistic part. So he is both immanent and transcendent at the same time. That's what panentheism is. But again, the goal here is to bring God close. We want to feel him. We want to be in interaction with him. We don't want our prayers to God to be, oh, like we're texting heaven. We want to have a meeting with God where he sits at the table, not on Zoom, like physically present with God. That's what the author's trying to ram home. Then he gets into an analogy to physically illustrate panentheism. And he draws on this a lot. I'll just mention it briefly. I'm not sure how much it adds, to be honest, once you get the idea. Sometimes, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman was writing in the early modern period, but really his culture that he was living in what was originally Poland and then became White Russia, was more the more medieval type of thinking. And sometimes when you read medieval philosophy, the examples that they bring to prove a point are harder to understand than the point itself. And this kind of is verging on that. But the idea, he says, that the sun is shining rays. If you look at the ray of the sun after it's left the sun, you could identify like in my office here, I'm sitting on the 9th floor. I'm in Manhattan here. Light is coming through from the sun. Those are just a few rays coming out from the sun. We could trace them back to the globe of the sun and see their path all the way to my office. But that's once they've left the sun, they're identifiable rays. But what about within the sun? Before that ray left the sun, it wasn't identifiable as a ray. It was we only saw the globe of the sun. On the other hand, it must exist there. Otherwise, how did it kind of emerge from the sun? So that's the analogy he brings for panentheism. The identity of the ray of the sun while it's in the sun is a very flimsy identity. It's not really discernible within the globe of the sun. So similarly, we are all floating within God. We're in the energetic field of God. We're just blips on that energetic field. And since we're all inside God from at least one perspective, so therefore our existence is just nothing more than expression of the divine. I'm going to keep moving because we're doing questions at the end, and it's quite a Herculean task here to sum up all these chapters. And I'm just going to keep moving. I hope you're all following so far. Good.
Yeah, all good.
And you've learned it before, obviously, so not just coming in cold. Okay. Let me get to see what next thing here. I'll just read out the line I put it here. Our perception of the world is like the ray that has left the sun. We discern the existence of separate things, But in reality, the world's existence resembles the light ray inside the sun, which has no identity of its own and is absorbed in its source or cause. Okay. Page 45. Sure we all know. Okay. Chapter 4. Now we go to a new topic. So chapter 4 is about the divine attributes. And I know your immediate reaction is going to be, well, didn't I say that divine attributes was only chapter 8 onwards? True. I did say that. Let me give a clarification. Chapter 8 onwards is explaining how inside God, the 10 divine attributes, the 10 sephiros, are really one. The discussion here in chapter 4 is our relationship, the universe's relationship with the divine attributes. What effect do these attributes have on the physical structure of the world? So that's why it belongs here. Now, as you know, if you read the Torah, the Chumash, God has a bunch of different names. And the two which we focus on here are the tetragrammaton. I love that word. I think it's a Christian word, actually, but I just love it because it sounds, I don't know, something out of a Harry Potter book. The tetragrammaton is God's four-lettered name, spelled Yud, followed by Hey, followed by Vav, followed by Hey. It's so holy that but traditionally we don't even say the letters. So people refer to them as either Yud K, Vav K, saying the Hey as a kuf, so as to distance ourselves from pronouncing the word, or sometimes it's called Havaya, which brilliantly is just the word spelled backwards. But this name is never pronounced. It was pronounced by the high priest in the Holy Temple once a year. The only people did pronounce it, by the way, were the Sabbateans in the 17th century. That was one of the innovations of the false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, that you're allowed to say it. So I'm going to call that either Havaya or Tetragrammaton. And obviously, when we read that in the Torah, we just say God, or we just say Adonai when we read it, which means my master, but we don't read the name. And two, I mean, if you would read the name, okay, let's forget about that. Number two, Elohim, it's written in the Torah Elohim, but again, so as not to take God's name in vain. I mean, obviously, we're not taking his name in vain. We're discussing Torah, but just in case there's a custom not to pronounce it. Elohim is an interesting name because it's actually written in the plural. So that's odd for monotheism. It means judge, but it's the plural, judges, really. And that word is actually used in the Torah in reference to a human judge. It says, do not curse an Elohim, meaning a judge. So we interestingly have a word which is both plural, can be used for a human. It could be used in reference to angels, also Elohim. But generally, it refers to God as invested in nature through the filter of Mother Nature, and that's why actually in Hebrew the word Elohim has the same numerical value as the word Hateva, meaning nature, the nature. Now, Kabbalah. So what we're going to say here, even though there's 10 divine attributes, we're going to focus on two. God says either give or withhold. So in Kabbalah, that's chesed. Chesed means I want to give. It's symbolized by the right hand. Gevurah, gevurah is symbolized, means withhold, do not give. Which is obviously very fundamental to, remember, we're dealing here with attributes that is God's relationship with the world. So at the core level, every decision that God makes is, am I going to give humanity, or not just humanity, birds, trees, everything? Am I going to give, or am I going to withhold? Am I going to give blessing? I'm going to withhold. Am I going to give life or withhold life? God forbid. And so Kabbalah identifies the name Tetragrammaton with Yud Ke Vav Ke with giving, chesed, and here Elohim is identified with Gevurah, with divine withholding. Gevurah prevents energy and revelation from coming down and being disclosed to the creation so as to energize and sustain them overtly. Why is withholding important? What I'm doing now is withholding. I wrote this whole book. I've got all these ideas swimming in my head, but I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. So therefore, any teacher practices gevurah. It's withholding some of the information in your head so that the information that comes out of your mouth is actually comprehensible. A genius is someone who is brilliant and understood, but someone who's brilliant and you can't understand what they're saying, you just call them a madman. They're just crazy, right? Because you can't get what they're saying. They're not practicing gevurah. So teaching is gevurah. Gevurah is also when we form a fetus from a cell, we're adding form. Anything related to form is gevurah, because form is what distinguishes a hat from a shirt, a chicken from a turkey, has different form. So the multiplicity of forms in the universe is all through gevurah, withholding some divine light. Now, this is a balance. If God completely restrained and diminished the emanation of his energy, there would be nothing left to power the world. The diminishment then was more of a veiling than an actual blocking of God's energy. God's gevurah doesn't prevent us from receiving his energy. It modifies what we receive so that we don't sense that it's coming from God. Okay, so we just see chair, table. Even though God became the table, there's divine energy there pulsating. The gevurah takes away the connection with God, so our senses just see it as table. Nevertheless, even though we don't perceive it, these diminishments are in fact expressions of God's might. This is a midrash. It sounds better in the original Hebrew. Hein gevurosa. Because in the Hebrew, you could just say the word twice to emphasize it. In English, it just sounds stupid. They are his powers of gevurah. But in Hebrew, it's powerful. That basically, here's the point. If you want an experience of God, what would you say? I want to experience, let him come to me, talk to me, let him tell me something, or even a dream or a vision. Then I'll experience God, right? And he's saying, you know what? The fact that you don't see God in the table is as much an expression of God as a direct communication, because the direct communication is his chesed, it's his giving, but his withholding is also a divine fiat, right? The fact that he withheld the energy, he had to invoke gevurah. And if you get in touch with gevurah, it's as much God as chesed. So the invisibility of God is now flipped remarkably, that the sensory experience of no God was created by God. And that realization is a paradigm shift. Hein gevurosa, that the absence of God was a brilliant act of veiling of God himself. And so I put it like this: is a famous story they tell you when you learn Hasidic teachings. Instead of wondering, I see a world, but does God exist? We should be thinking, obviously God exists, but how am I here? Panentheism is we're all swimming in God. So technically speaking, our existence is harder to understand than God's existence. It was a cute, I like throwing in these cute ones. Okay, let's move on. Okay, more on the attributes. That's chapter 5. So, we have here from Genesis Rabbah, that is a midrash, one of the larger midrashic collections. Originally, God thought to create the world with his attribute of judgment, and he saw the world wouldn't last, so he added his attribute of compassion. So that's, I mentioned you before, straight out of Rabbinic Judaism, we have the idea of divine attributes. Now, are they real, or are they merely metaphorical? So here we have a major difference between Maimonides and the whole school of Jewish philosophy and the Hasidic Kabbalistic school. Maimonides maintained that the attributes are not real. So if you read the Torah, God sounds like They call it now self-soothing. Therapists call it self-soothing. Can you, if you get in a mood, can you control, calm yourself down? That's a sign of mental health. So when you read the Chumash, it sounds like God is not doing that too well. Like he's getting angry, he's getting jealous, he's destroying people, he's changing his mind. And Maimonides felt that this is just symbolic. It's really just to get the average Joe interested, but God's not literally changing his mind. He's not literally getting angry because he is perfect, and perfect people, perfect entities don't do that. Hasidism and Kabbalah introduces a new layer. Okay, so I want you to imagine now, top layer is infinite perfect God. So that's, Maimonides called it the immovable mover. Kabbalists call it Ein Sof, the endless light of God. Same thing. Then you have the realm of angels and souls. This is a spiritual space. And it's all over the Talmud and Midrash. Souls go to heaven, souls coming down from heaven, angels doing their thing. There's even a demonology in Judaism, which is interesting. But let's just call this the angelic realm. And again, everyone's agreeing on this. Maimonides, Rabbinic Judaism, Kabbalistic Judaism, Hasidic Judaism. There's the angelic space, and then you have the physical world. The Kabbalistic teachings, which are articulated here in Hasidism, adds another layer. And that's a layer between Ein Sof, or the immovable mover, and the angelic realm. And that layer is, I like to call it the divine realm. And it's the place of the divine attributes, the place of the Sephiros. And so when Maimonides reads the Torah and he says, this can't be literal. And therefore he says, it's all just kind of a metaphor. It doesn't really exist. God never gets angry. The Kabbalists say, no, actually he does. What we're talking about here is the attribute of divine anger was invoked. But that doesn't, and if he's nice and kind, then the attribute of chesed, of divine kindness, is invoked. And it's the same God, it's the same Ein Sof, but sometimes he's shining through one attribute and sometimes he's shining through another. So by adding this additional layer of the divine realm, we can now understand, we can now situate all the stories in the Torah as describing an actual reality of a change in emphasis or activation of one of the Sephiros over the other. And that's a very fundamental point, which comes out of this chapter. Now, this has solved a tremendous problem. Monotheism is a huge problem, because if God is one, how comes there are a billion different species of animals and plants? How comes, I don't know, in America here, it's like a consumer society. You go buy toothpaste, it's like 300 brands. How comes there is multiplicity coming out of unity? So the answer of Kabbalah is basically the Sephiros, that we have a realm which is not created, it's not outside God, it's emanated is the correct term to use. It's like light shining out of a source. It's still within the realm of the divine, but on the other hand, we're distant enough from God's essence that there can be multiple flavors of Sephiros doing different things. And therefore, when God is acting in the world in different ways, those variety of actions are anchored in various different Sephiros. And nevertheless, we say that those Sephiros, even though they're multiples, they are still divine. They're not like Christianity says that there's it's called a Trinity. This got three things in the Godhead. No, they're actually one with God. And that is the Kabbalah's theological revolution. Okay, now let me keep going. Chapter 6, integrating the attributes. So here it gets a little bit more complicated. This is not an earlier Kabbalistic text, it's a later development. But there's this idea that every one of the 10 attributes has a little bit of all the others. And that's really important. Here's an example. In essence, Gevurah is a form of chesed, of kindness. Gevurah is tough love, the restraint necessary to make God's loving act of creating you possible. On the other hand, chesed within Gevurah ensures that the diminishment of God's light is constructive for the sake of creation. Gevurah within chesed enables God's light to shine at the correct, disciplined intensity appropriate for each world and created entity. So that is a feat of the integration of attributes, how they're not kind of, and this is really important, by the way, because otherwise they are kind of 10 different gods. Why are the 10 spheros not 10 gods? Because they're all interconnected. It's a web, like the World Wide Web is interconnected. There's a fundamental interconnectedness of the spheres. They're not acting in isolation, and they act in unity. And therefore, that's one of the proofs that we're dealing here with a unified system. Okay. I hope you're still alert, because it gets a little bit subtle now. Here is a summary. So they're very nice. The attributes are integrated. Sounds nice. What's the big deal? So here's the big deal. I'm going to read this out. Above in chapters 1 to 3, we understood that nothing exists outside God to be true because God creates the world continually, and therefore the world has no independent existence of its own. But our discussion of the divine attributes from chapter 4 onwards has added a complication, because in hindsight, chapters 1 to 3 seem to be speaking only from the perspective of Havaya, which continually provides creative energy, voiding the world of its independent existence. But from the perspective of Elohim, which hides that creative force, it would seem that there is a separate world. Isn't the whole purpose of Elohim energy to make separateness real? So you're sitting, imagine you could go and sit inside Elohim, the attribute of Elohim, which you can't, it's inside God, but just thought experiment. You would actually, Elohim makes real boundaries, real separateness, not a joke. I mean, we are separate beings. The cells in our body are separate from each other. Separateness is real, and that's the power of Gevurah. So it's all very well that God continually creates the world, but isn't that his chesed part of being nice? But what about his Gevurah part? From that angle, it seems that the separateness is real, and therefore the world is independent, really. So chapter 6 clarifies that even the name Elohim, which diminishes and hides God's light, is really kindness like the name Havaya. That's a direct quote. That means that even God's power of diminishment, Elohim, is not absolute. Its purpose, goal, and inner identity is disclosure. So ultimately, even from the perspective of Elohim, there's no separate world, because Elohim is never completely devoid of Havaya. So if you were sitting in the driver, you were driving Elohim, you're not making a separate world, because there's always Havaya, like in the other in the other seat, who is influencing your driving. So because of the interconnectedness of the energy, so therefore we've kind of saved the central thesis of the Tanya. It's quite a complicated point. You might want to, we could go back to it, but that's basically the thematically how this fits into the flow of the chapters. Now, chapter 7 is the hardest chapter of the book. And in a way, it's the most important chapter of the book. And in a way, it's a disappointing chapter. I'll tell you what. So basically, chapter 7, we get back to the theme of upper and lower unification. That was all quoted even before the first chapter in what's called the Shaar, the introductory page of the Tanya. He says, I'm writing this book for one reason. I want to explain what the Zohar means when it speaks of upper and lower unification. And if you look in the Zohar says that when we recite the Shema, the first verse, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is at the level of upper unification. And the second line, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Vayed, is a level of lower unification. Now, the Zohar has its own definition of these terms, which I'm not going to deal with. They're slightly different from the Tanya, because the Tanya's a Hasidic work, and there are subtle differences between Hasidism and Kabbalah, which don't have the chance to get into that now. So I'm just going to focus on what he means. Okay. So there's a major other point here, another attribute that we're going to deal with. So we've had the attribute of God's kindness, chesed. That's the creative power. We've had the attribute of God's gevurah, and that's withholding. Now we're going to deal with the attribute of malchus. Malchus is the 10th of the divine energies. Malchus is also sometimes called Shekhinah, the divine feminine. And the role of Malchus is the only one of the 10 that directly interfaces the universe. The first 9 energies have no direct contact with the universe. Only the 10th energy has direct contact. And there's a thing called the chariot, which you might have heard of. It's at the beginning of Ezekiel. There's a whole description of it. That's a piece of apparatus